We're going to kick off with the biggest thing over the past week or so that's definitely impacted not only general practice, but almost every aspect of medicine in the UK. And it's a question that we're asking, given the judgments that have happened, and that's around the prospect, is the GMC actually still fit for purpose? Now, the reason we're asking this is there has been a recent case from the MPTS, so that's the group that basically assesses doctors and their kind of impact and stuff from the GMC. And it was a rather interesting judgment, wasn't it, Andy?
Yeah, it was interesting. So I guess we've been having a look at the Pulse article. It's been going around on Twitter, but obviously, it's a case. There are real people involved, so being sort of careful what we're saying. But we're really looking at the general sort of implications of the case. And my understanding, Gandhi, and you might have a different understanding, is that there was something that happened actually some years ago that led to a patient complaint where the patient has alleged that the GP did not conduct a physical examination. The doctor's documentation at the time, I don't think it was in general practice, it was in a different clinical environment. The doctor documented at the time that they did complete a physical examination. The patient has said that it didn't happen. This has led to a complaint that the doctor has incorrectly or dishonestly recorded information in the patient notes. So that's one side of it. This has the GMC taken patient testimony over the documentation that a doctor's made at the time in patient notes, which is really important. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in a minute. And then the other aspect to this is that this doctor apologized for the distress caused by what had happened and been perceived by the patient, and that this was taken by the patient and then the GMC as an admission of guilt, which actually runs contrary to GMC guidance about managing complaints, which says actually an apology is not an admission of guilt and that this is something that is useful to do and that is helpful for patients. So there's quite a lot to pick apart there and quite worrying. Do you have anything else to say, Gandhi, about the incident itself that I haven't managed to convey?
No, so like you said, Andy, I mean, that's the basis of the actual complaint and the stuff itself. Now, we've not had a chance to go through the MPTS files themselves, so you can actually do so, and they are available in terms of the initial judgments and stuff. And I believe it's something like 46 pages. So apologies, YouTube viewers, we've not had a chance to go through that because of everything else that we're trying to cover today. But it sets out some of the kind of principles, the document. It's kind of like a transcript of a trial. So if any of you have been following things like obviously the Amber Heard, what's the name? Johnny Depp trial.
Johnny Depp.
And stuff.
Yeah,
it's kind of like reading the trial transcripts and that kind of stuff from that. But I know that there's stuff in there around, like you say, the examination process by the doctor, whether it did or didn't happen, and the MPTS, so the group that are judging this, have leaned more in favor of the patient's perspective of recollection that it didn't happen versus the documentation in the notes, which is a confusing and worrying element that documentation may not be felt to be appropriate, even though it's done live at the time. And obviously this is referencing an event that happened several years ago, which that's the only evidence often many of us have, because how many patients do we see on a daily basis? How if you go for a few years in advance, how much of that are you actually going to remember that one single interaction, unless it was truly memorable? But there is this bigger thing about the fact that the apology is being used by basically as a stick to say that it's an admission of guilt. Now, interestingly, there has been a development since the news story broke, hasn't there, Andy? So I guess
so that's the second. That's the second story, if we've got it queued up correctly. Gandhi, I'm not sure I've got that there queued up, but essentially there was a backtracking might not be the right word, but there was a change in position from the GMC. And tell us a bit more about that, Gandhi. I've not got the story on screen.
Yeah, I mean, so we've taken some of the stories from one of our friends of the channel, Pulse Today, and if you go to their page, it is, I think, the third or fourth one, but effectively the GMC have admitted that actually apologizing shouldn't be an admission of guilt, and that won't be used in future. Interestingly, they're not using it to reverse the current decision so far. Obviously, it's still an ongoing case, so whether that will change in the coming days or week, we don't know. But so far, they have said that in future that won't be an applicable thing in terms of using an apology as an admission of guilt. But it's still really worrying that that's happened, because it's now set a precedent in the case reviews and that kind of stuff that's happened. So it's going to be an evolving situation, and what this looks like moving forward, I think, is going to have real ramifications for everything. The indemnity organizations are all looking at this. I know there's been loads of chatter on Twitter and various other social media channels about this case. It has serious ramifications for how medicine will respond to patient complaints in the future. It's a bit crazy, to be honest, in that sense.
Yeah, I think the next time I'm responding to a complaint, I'll be having a good look at whether it's still advisable at that point in time to apologise, and how you construct that apology. And I'll be looking to MPS for a bit of guidance, I think, when I'm doing that. Yeah, it is a worrying development. It's also so. This is obviously a big thing because we ended up talking about this in the practice clinical meeting. So something has to be quite a big deal to kind of make it sort of onto that agenda. It wasn't agendaized, but it was brought up by one of our salaried GPs who actually said he has been through the transcripts actually. And he often does that because one of his friends is an MPS lawyer. So he has a particular sort of route into these things. And he found it really, really interesting. And actually, he was more worried about this issue of patient testimony being given precedent over documentation, because often when something's happened many years ago, I mean, for us, the honest thing to say is actually, we may not remember that particular patient interaction. We cannot really go on our memory a lot of the time. We turn to our notes, which we make faithfully at the time, and that is what we rely on in terms of documenting what happened at the time. The patient's recollection has obviously been given precedent over that. Obviously we don't know the particular case, but patients, I guess, they have less interaction with the doctor. That's more of a special interaction for them in their day, in their week, in their year, often of more significance. So one might argue that may be more memorable for them. But equally, we know from a lot of work around memory that memory can be fallible, and around just other areas of legal work and recollection. So it's just a worrying area, really, because we often turn to our notes and our documentation as the way that we are defensive and demonstrate that we have done what is needed to avoid allegations of malpractice. And if that doesn't stand anymore, that's really, really worrying. Really interested to know what people out there, think. We've got a number of people watching. People may have some comments, on this, and if they've been discussing this issue with their teams.
Absolutely. No, I think if you are joining us live or if you're watching us on the replay, even definitely in the comments, stick in your views on this case, because I think this is something we may end up coming back to. Like I said, I think this case has and is going to have seismic ramifications for the way that complaints have happened across the board when it comes to medical healthcare, not just general practice. And it'll be really interesting to see what happens as this develops. So we may come back to this on the EGP Learning in a couple of weeks or so, once obviously more of the cases develop from there.
Yeah, and just another thing that came up in our discussion about this in our meeting was people were just wondering, are there other factors here? So it was discussed that this doctor may be an international medical graduate, and that often that can have an influence, potentially, some people say, on GMC outcomes, and I think it actually may bear through in some of the statistics around GMC outcomes as well. And also saying that sometimes there are things that are not clear even from the transcripts, and there may be other factors that have contributed to this. And an interesting discussion, not necessarily directed directly at this case, because I don't think this seems to be a factor, but we just had a discussion around actually the response to a complaint or a negative outcome can often be what gets people in more trouble than actually the incident that happened, which was interesting. A little bit thinking about the Philip Schofield issues. Sometimes the response is worse than the actual thing that may have happened. Obviously not directly related to this case, but it was just an interesting discussion. Sometimes they say, with politicians, it's not the crime that gets them, it's how they cover it up, that can lead to all sorts of allegations of probity. But I'm not making those allegations against this doctor, but that was just a very interesting discussion that we had.
And I think if you would like us to have a look at this in more detail and possibly get somebody a bit more expert in to come and talk about it, absolutely stick that down so that we can look at that in the comments or something like that, because we do respond to our listeners and stuff. And we're coming to an example of that in a second. I guess just before we transfer over to that, a couple of resources I probably recommend people have a look at. So number one, another friend of the podcast, Dr. Rachel Morris, who does the You Are Not a Frog podcast, highly recommend. She's done a recent episode with one of the indemnity organizer lawyer people. I've forgotten which company, unfortunately, and it's about how to respond to complaints. And actually, it's something I've really taken on board, because having gone through a couple of processes for trainees and even for myself and stuff, it gives you a bit more perspective of how to respond to complaints. Really interesting on the whole comment that the first thing that she mentioned is apologize. So whether that will still be applicable advice now, we will find out. But the other thing as well, and when it comes to documentation, many EGP learners know I try and help as many people as we can when it comes to documentation and stuff. Checking out tools that can help you do that, macro keypads, shortcuts, that kind of stuff. Absolutely make sure you're using these to help you make your life easier. Definitely consider the transcription stuff. So did some recent episodes with companies around their digital dictation and transcription services and stuff. They can really be time saving and help in that side of things. And often the time to document is the thing that means that people don't document what they've done properly. And that can help you speed up your, the workflows and make life a little bit easier for you and things. So I think those are definitely some things I would recommend having a look at.